Kevin McCracken here. I'm interested in doing an action research dissertation that focuses on some evaluation project, probably in higher education. So I started by looking at some dissertations similar to what I envisioned working on, and I wanted to see what their lit reviews were like and kind of the breadth and depth. And I was rather surprised that the lit reviews were much more brief than I expected, and they really didn't provide the kind of information that I really wanted. So with this project in R711, I set out to create exactly what I was looking for, which is a recent lit review of evaluation research, and looking particularly at methods and models as they apply to higher education program evaluation. So I looked at more than 20 articles describing programs from a wide variety of institutions and disciplines, everything from agriculture to nursing, psychology, even one report that looked at an entire university. And most of them talked about the rationale for the evaluation. Usually this was to meet some kind of accreditation requirement, but it was very rare actually to see some model applied to the evaluation approach. So when I did see this, I saw a couple of articles that employed a logic model, where they're talking about inputs and outputs and outcomes. And this model is particularly helpful if there is some deficiency in the outcome. It's easier to trace back to some input or activity that might have an effect. So there's a little bit of a cause and effect evaluation that can take place. So I was really surprised that there weren't more evaluation articles that employed this model, but there really weren't very many. What I saw as a most common application of a model was Kirkpatrick's 4 levels, so reaction, learning, behavior, and results. But in total, I would estimate that only about 20% of the articles that I reviewed had any kind of model whatsoever. What I saw a lot of, and this is predictable, were a lot of surveys. Students, faculty, and alumni were surveyed extensively. This was very reminiscent of Dr. Ozul's evaluation course in the simulation project that was an evaluation of a higher ed program, and there were a lot of survey data. The survey data included both qualitative and quantitative input. And so there were just a lot of them. This really seems to be the foundation of higher ed evaluation. There were also, it was very common to see descriptors, maybe number of faculty publications, undergraduate GPA, test scores, demographic information. And I suspect this is because those kinds of data are typically available publicly, or at least easily accessible. And so, if they're easily accessible, a researcher or an evaluator is probably going to use them to make a determination of the quality of the program. So there were some surprises, however. I want to talk about those briefly. One of them was directed at dissertation evaluations. Now, prior to this lit review, I would have assumed that evaluating a dissertation or in aggregate dissertations would be a really good direct measure of the quality of instruction in a higher ed program. But what one of the articles indicated was that it's actually pretty difficult to use a dissertation even if you have a really well-developed rubric and you have a lot of inter-rater reliability, it still can create a logic fallacy. So the post hoc error, where you assume that B is the result of A simply because A precedes B, applies here. So the mere fact that doctoral instruction precedes the creation and delivery of a dissertation doesn't necessarily mean that that instruction actually contributed significantly to the quality of that dissertation. Now, oftentimes it does, but there are other explanations. One of them might be that a high quality program attracts high quality applicants, and the actual writing ability and critical thinking skills of the incoming students may be well above average, and those are significant contributors to the quality of a dissertation. And in fact, the instruction received during the doctoral program may not have that much of an effect on the outcome. Also, in some programs, in some states, there's funding that's tied to certain metrics for evaluation, usually at the university level. And sometimes those metrics can include the quality of a dissertation. So if there's any kind of discretionary funding tied to a quality metric, it's pretty much guaranteed that there's going to be a focus on that metric. And so if dissertation quality is one of those metrics, there could be a tendency for faculty to overmanage the development of those dissertations. So in other words, rather than let a doctoral student kind of maybe flounder and come up with a solution to a problem on their own that may be good but not great, there could be a tendency for faculty to turn that good solution into a great solution. So one way to minimize these confounding effects is to have a thorough writing assessment early in the program so that you can essentially create a pre-test, post-test comparison, at least with writing skills, and you can also do the same thing with critical thinking skills. So this is an area of potentially future research. I'm also just interested in the overall development of program satisfaction surveys. And so one of the things that surprised me here is that it makes sense that student program satisfaction would correlate with student perception of work preparedness. And in fact, that's what the literature tells us. But in the rare occasion where there was also input from employers, what this particular study found is that there's not a statistically significant correlation between students' perception of work preparedness and employers' perception of work preparedness. In other words, students who are satisfied with their program think they're ready to go do the work upon graduation. This study says that their employers disagree with that assessment. So I think that there's a fundamental disconnect there. And it really would be an area of further investigation. In fact, if I were to do this project over again, I think I would focus more on external stakeholders, particularly alumni and employers. There were a few surveys or articles that included input from alumni, very few that included input from employers. So I think this is an area that needs to be explored a little bit more. It really kind of fits with Kirkpatrick's results level. And even though it may apply more to practitioners than it does to researchers and those going into academia, but I think it's an area that could be explored a little bit more. Also, just the overall development of satisfaction surveys is of interest to me, probably because in my work, I'm currently involved with a group developing a satisfaction survey. And so, this is kind of, as we discussed in our online discussion a few weeks ago, curiosity and interest is really a good starting point for developing a research agenda. So this is an area that I may want to consider in the future. And then finally, an area that I'd like to learn more about, and I'd like to see how to better incorporate them into evaluation reports, is the use of citation indexes. So the H-index, developed by Hirsch in 2005, is used fairly widely, and essentially let's say a researcher has an H-index value of 10. That tells you that they have 10 publications that have been cited 10 or more times in the literature. And so if you think about it, it's a combination of both productivity but also impact or quality. So if someone has a blockbuster article or book chapter that's cited widely and has a big effect on the field, but subsequently all of their publications are of minimal impact, they're going to have a relatively low H-index. On the other hand, someone who is prolific, highly productive, but really not having much of an impact on the field, they're also going to have a low H-index. So I think that there are ways, this is not a perfect measure by any means, and there are others, and so maybe there's a way to triangulate different citation indexes to come up with a better measure. But I think that it could be a way to compare across programs, at least from similar institutions of similar size and in similar disciplines. But I just think it's an area of interest to me, and certainly an area that could be explored further.